let's talk about something no one warns you about. The final move an avoidant makes when they feel like they're losing control of the narrative. Avoidants, you know the type, they pull away the moment things get close. They ghost, they deflect, they criticize your needs as too much, and they vanish when vulnerability is required. But here's the part most people miss. What happens after you've done the hard thing and started moving on? That's when it happens, when you're finally reclaiming your power, rebuilding your confidence, and no longer making excuses for their behavior. That's when they show up with the last toxic move. They reach out, not to take responsibility, not to rebuild, but to reopen the emotional loop. Maybe it's thinking about you, or I miss us, or even worse. They start showing up on your social media, liking photos, responding to stories. Subtle, calculated. Why? Because your detachment threatens their control. You're slipping out of the emotional tether they relied on to feel validated. Without actually investing in the relationship, this move isn't about love. It's about control. It's about reassurance for them and confusion for you. The moment you respond, even slightly, they win. Because now you're wondering again. Maybe they've changed. Spoiler, they haven't. They're just uncomfortable with you not chasing anymore. And if you're not aware of this game, you'll get pulled back into the loop. Same pain, same patterns. So here's your power. Don't engage, not with bitterness, not with revenge, just with boundaries. You don't need to slam the door. You just don't need to open it again. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to understand their chaos and start protecting your peace. When someone with avoidant tendencies starts to sense that they're no longer the center of your emotional world, it unsettles them. These are people who are used to maintaining control in a relationship by keeping you at arm's length. They tend to avoid vulnerability, commitment, and direct communication about feelings. But they also get a subtle sense of security, knowing you're still emotionally hooked, still wondering, still hoping, still checking in. So when they feel you letting go, that perceived control starts to slip. This is when they make a move. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's a vague message. Sometimes it's a reaction to your story on social media. Other times it's something as small as an accidental text that doesn't really say anything at all, but serves the purpose of reminding you they're still around. What most people don't realize is that these gestures aren't random. They're calculated responses to a shift in emotional power. You were once chasing, now you're not. And that imbalance creates discomfort for someone who's emotionally avoidant. They thrive in a space where they can dictate the distance, where they can feel safe and in control without having to do the emotional heavy lifting. But your detachment, your silence, that disrupts their entire dynamic. When you finally pull away, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, they feel the loss of that emotional energy. For someone avoidant, that energy served a quiet but constant purpose. It reminded them they were wanted without having to risk anything emotionally themselves. The moment you stop supplying that energy, a void opens up for them. Not because they're ready to commit, not because they've had a revelation about their behavior, but because they want back the emotional safety net you once provided. This is when they come back with their version of breadcrumbs, vague expressions of nostalgia, check-ins, or even flirtation. But make no mistake, this reappearance isn't rooted in a desire to repair or rebuild something meaningful. It's a response to the discomfort of losing their grip on your emotions. This pattern is incredibly confusing to the person on the receiving end. You've done the work to distance yourself. You've started to let go, maybe even to heal. Then suddenly, they resurface, and it feels like a glimmer of hope. You start to question your decision to walk away. Maybe you think they've changed or had a breakthrough. But more often than not, what you're seeing is not transformation, it's self-preservation. They don't like the feeling of not being desired. They don't like that you're no longer waiting in the wings. So they throw just enough emotional bait to see if you'll bite. If you do, the dynamic resets. They retreat, you chase, and the cycle begins again. Understanding this is crucial, because once you see it for what it is, a reaction to loss of control, it becomes easier not to internalize it or misread it as genuine interest. The way avoidants try to pull you back in after you've started detaching is rarely dramatic or overt. It's subtle, almost easy to miss if you're not paying attention. That's what makes it so dangerous. These gestures are not about reconnection or taking responsibility for the hurt they've caused. Instead, they're designed to create confusion and reopen emotional loops that keep you stuck. You may receive a casual, "Hey, how have you been?" after weeks or months of silence. Or they might suddenly start engaging with your posts online, watching your stories, liking your photos, maybe even commenting something small and seemingly harmless. At first glance, it can look like interest or regret. But there's a deeper pattern at play, one that's less about love and more about control. Avoidants struggle with emotional intimacy, but that doesn't mean they're indifferent to losing emotional influence. They crave connection, just not responsibility. They want to know they can still access you when they need reassurance without the expectation of showing up fully. So when you stop reacting to their distance or pulling for connection, they sense that shift. And instead of confronting their own discomfort or changing their behavior, they lean into manipulation cloaked in charm or nostalgia. It's a subtle form of emotional sabotage. It gives just enough to reignite your hope, but not enough to create real safety or forward movement. This tactic works because it's non-confrontational. It doesn't force them to make promises or admit fault. It simply plants seeds of doubt in your mind. You begin wondering if maybe they missed you. Maybe this is the moment they finally realized what they lost. Maybe, just maybe, they're coming back changed. That's the emotional loop they want to reopen. The one that keeps you in a state of anticipation, unsure and emotionally vulnerable. And once you're in that space again, you're easier to influence, easier to manage, easier to keep close without them having to step up. Even when their messages feel harmless, even when they say things like, "I was just thinking about you," the motive behind it isn't innocent. If they were truly thinking about you in a meaningful way, they'd show up differently, with clarity, with accountability, with action that supports their words. But that's not what happens. Instead, you get ambiguity. You get gestures that give just enough spark to light up your hope, but no flame to warm your heart. What makes this behavior especially damaging is that it triggers your longing and your empathy. You remember the good moments, the potential, the things they said in passing that hinted at depth. But all of that is being used against you now. They're not coming back to build. They're coming back to test the waters and see if the emotional door is still open. And when it is, they often retreat again, leaving you in the same cycle you fought so hard to escape. When someone with avoidant tendencies reaches back out after a period of silence, it's tempting to interpret that as a sign of emotional growth or rediscovered love. But more often than not, these gestures aren't coming from a place of love, they're coming from ego. It's not about rebuilding a connection. It's about checking that they still have a place in your mind, your heart, your energy. To them, your attention is a form of control, even if they claim they don't want commitment. As long as you're emotionally reactive, whether that's through hope, anger, confusion, or longing, they know they still have influence. And for someone avoidant, influence without responsibility is the perfect situation. They get to feel wanted, significant, even powerful, without being accountable for your emotional needs. The ego doesn't like to be forgotten. It doesn't want to be replaced. So when you start moving on, when you start setting boundaries, when you stop reaching out, when you no longer engage in their push-pull dynamic, it triggers something in them. But what it triggers isn't love, it's discomfort. It's a loss of control over how they're seen, how they're remembered, and what role they play in your story. And that discomfort often drives their decision to reappear. They don't want you to be indifferent. They want to feel like they could have you back if they chose to. That knowledge strokes the ego. It makes them feel safe in their detachment. It keeps you close enough to be an option, but never close enough to feel truly secure. Their re-entry isn't a commitment. It's a recalibration of emotional dynamics. They're not saying, "I want to be with you now, and here's what I'm ready to do differently." Instead, they're saying, "I want to know you still care, just in case I need that someday." And that statement is rarely spoken directly. It's implied through vague check-ins, nostalgic references, or attempts to stir old emotions. But at its core, the intent is about ego management, not emotional intimacy. They may not even be fully conscious of it themselves, but their behavior reveals the truth. They are seeking to soothe their own discomfort, not yours. This is what makes the avoidance cycle so frustrating. You may find yourself pulled back in not because things feel better, but because things feel familiar. And in that familiarity, there's a momentary hit of connection, just enough to disrupt your progress, to make you question your boundaries, to make you second guess the reasons you pulled away in the first place. That's the trap. Their return isn't driven by love's responsibility. It's driven by the ego's fear of being irrelevant. And the moment you re-engage, even out of curiosity or politeness, that fear is eased. Not for you, for them. Which is why, shortly after that interaction, they often disappear again, leaving you with all the questions they never intended to answer. Their presence isn't a gift of love, it's a test of control. And understanding this shift from romanticizing their return to recognizing its ego-based roots is the first step in truly breaking free. When someone who has consistently avoided emotional intimacy suddenly reaches out after you've begun detaching, the natural instinct is to respond. You may feel curious, nostalgic, even hopeful. But the most powerful and self-respecting move you can make in that moment is to not engage. Not out of spite, not out of trying to win some emotional game, but because engaging reopens the door to confusion, false hope, and emotional regression. When you've been through cycles of hot and cold behavior with someone, your nervous system gets wired to expect inconsistency. So even a small message from them can feel disproportionately significant. You might think, what if this time is different? But if their actions haven't shown real change, then any engagement on your part becomes a form of self-abandonment. You're sacrificing your peace to entertain a fantasy they're not willing to build with you. Avoidants don't usually come back with clarity. They don't return with accountability or commitment. They come back with just enough ambiguity to pull you out of your alignment. That's why not responding isn't about being cold or punishing them. It's about protecting the emotional progress you've made. Silence is not cruelty. It's a boundary. It says, I'm no longer available for inconsistency. I'm no longer interested in emotional breadcrumbs. I value peace over potential. When you respond, even lightly, maybe just a hope you're well or a reaction to their message, you send a signal that your door is still open, that you're still available to be pulled into their dynamic. But this time, you know better. You know that your peace didn't come from their presence, it came from your distance. You started to heal when you stopped trying to decode their behavior and started focusing on your own self-worth. Engaging again can undo that work in an instant. Because once they know they still have access to you, the urgency to change disappears. Why would they evolve if they can still reach you without doing the work? Choosing not to respond isn't always easy. It can feel counterintuitive, especially when you've spent so much time longing for them to reach out. But real strength is shown not when you get what you wanted, but when you realize you deserve something better, something clearer, something consistent. If they've changed, they'll show it over time with action, not impulse-driven messages. And if they haven't, your silence will be the mirror they need. But that's not your responsibility anymore. You're not here to be someone's lesson. You're here to protect your heart. By not engaging, you reclaim your time, your clarity, and your energy. You stop negotiating with someone who was never willing to meet you halfway. You stop re-entering a story that keeps ending the same way. The power lies in the choice to no longer respond to chaos, not because you're bitter, but because peace is too precious to risk for someone who never valued it when they had it. Recognizing patterns in an avoidant partner's behavior is one of the most important steps in breaking free from the emotional cycles that keep you stuck. It's easy to get caught up in the moment. The unexpected message, the sudden warmth, the brief flicker of what feels like hope. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you start to see the repetition, the distancing after closeness, the reappearances when you begin to move on, the charm that's not followed by change. Once you become aware of that pattern, you can begin to detach from the emotional highs and lows it creates and start protecting your peace instead of chasing connection. Avoidants don't tend to offer consistent emotional safety. They give you just enough to keep you wondering, enough to trigger your empathy, enough to make you second guess your own boundaries. But they rarely provide the clarity, effort, or accountability that true emotional intimacy requires. Protecting your peace means refusing to re-enter dynamics where confusion is the norm and your needs are minimized. It means setting boundaries not as punishment, but as protection for your growth, your healing, and your self-respect. When you start to value emotional consistency more than emotional intensity, your relationships change because your standards do. You no longer see their sudden reappearance as romantic or meaningful. You see it as familiar. You recognize that this is the same cycle, just with a new disguise. And when you can name the pattern, you can also choose to step out of it. That doesn't mean you stop feeling or caring. It means you stop compromising your emotional well-being for someone who doesn't show up in a healthy, reciprocal way. Healing isn't about pretending you're unaffected. It's about honoring the pain, learning from it, and deciding you're no longer available for anything that feels like it. Boundaries become your new filter. Not just with them, but with everyone. You stop explaining yourself to people who don't listen. You stop waiting for validation from someone who couldn't even meet you halfway. You stop giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who has already shown you the reality of who they are. And you start protecting your energy the way you once protected the relationship. You shift your focus from decoding their mixed signals to strengthening your own self-trust. The more you do that, the less attractive their inconsistency becomes. You begin to see that real love doesn't feel like emotional whiplash. It feels calm, it feels clear, it feels safe. Eventually, the power they once held over you fades, not because they changed, but because you did. You saw the pattern, you honored your healing, and you chose peace over possibility. That's when you know you've broken the cycle for good. Not when they stop reaching out, but when it no longer affects you when they do. That's what real freedom looks like. So, if you find yourself in that place, where someone who once dismissed your needs is suddenly resurfacing, showing just enough interest to stir old feelings, pause. Ask yourself not just what they're doing, but why. Are they showing up with clarity, consistency, and accountability? Or are they simply uncomfortable with your detachment, trying to reclaim emotional control they never truly earned? You deserve a love that doesn't arrive only when it's convenient. You deserve connection that doesn't confuse you, and you deserve peace that isn't constantly disrupted by someone else's indecision. Don't let someone's temporary discomfort pull you back into permanent pain. The final move avoidants make isn't about love. It's about control masked as curiosity, nostalgia, or regret. But when you see it clearly, you no longer fall for it. You don't respond out of loneliness or hope. You respond with silence, with strength, with boundaries. Because real power isn't in what you can hold onto, it's in what you're finally willing to let go of. Thank you for your time, your presence, and your willingness to hear the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If this message resonated with you, it's because you're already doing the work. You're not just breaking cycles, you're building a future that's no longer ruled by inconsistency. Stay grounded, stay strong. And most of all, stay true to the version of you that no longer settles for emotional breadcrumbs. Thank you, and take care.